Hello and welcome. It's so wonderful to be with you again, to sit at the hem of people that have gone through their journey and become that voice of authenticity, vulnerability, and share where they've been so we can learn from them. And our guest today, a dear friend, Casey Arrillaga, and he is sharing about his new book and the wisdom that is contained in it. So we're talking today about realistic hope. It's a family guide, a family survival guide for facing alcoholism and other addictions. Now, this is a conversation that many of us do not yet have the courage to talk about. So I invite you and all of us, as we sit together with Casey, to look inside of ourselves and have a humble, honest look at what may be in the way for us, even at a distant glance in something that's been in our family or something that's currently right in our experience. You're going to learn some wisdom, as I am, with Casey on how we can approach our life in new ways. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Casey. Can't wait to unpack this wonderful conversation.
Well, Tina Marie, thank you so much for having me. This is an honor. It's really fantastic to be here. And yes, of course, I'm thrilled that the book's coming out. But as you said, the book is really the culmination of a lifetime journey so far. And I'm going to say so far, because that journey's never over. At least I sure hope not.
Yes. And I've been able to sit with you on many mornings in conversation about these issues, and I've gleaned your wisdom. I love your approach. I love your diplomacy on how we can speak to one another as family members about things that are difficult, about things that are stressful, frustrating. Sometimes we can get to places where we're pulling our hair out because we know something's not exactly right in the relationship. But if we're not given skills and strategies on how to have effective conversations that draw people toward us, we can push on those buttons oh so easily that make that space for people to move away from us. And it's not the outcomes we want, but we feel completely inept. So today I'd love to have you help us understand your journey. How'd you get here? And then how do you help other families and family members and people that come to you admitting sometimes that they have addiction, or just completely not knowing how to have these courageous conversations? So what brought you to this stage in your life that said, I'm going to help people that have addictions and specifically alcoholism?
Well, thank you so much for asking that. Boy, in some ways it's a long answer. I'm going to try and keep it somewhat condensed. I was talking with someone one time and, we joked like, it all started with the Big Bang.
The Big Bang, yeah.
But I'm going to say my personal journey around addiction started with my birth parents. And they both showed hallmarks of sex and love addiction. And part of the evidence for that is they got pregnant on the first date. And that's me. So I am just the direct product of that. And my birth mother, from there, they got married. This was the late 1960s. And so it seemed like the right thing to do. They got married. And within a few days of getting married, my birth mother vanished and ran off with another guy. So she would have been pregnant with me at the time, which means I went along with the first affair. And that sort of set the stage, right? So fast forward a little bit. And I want to let you know, they were absolutely doing the best that they could. None of us in these family lines was raised with any of these skills. And when you talk about what inspires me to help people now, that's part of it. Is recognizing that the people who have often been through these difficulties for those very reasons are not being taught the skills on how to deal with the difficulties. There's nobody in the family often to say, hey, this thing is going really sideways in your family, but here's what you can do about it. Here's some ways to deal with it. Here are some skills and communication, and here's where you turn for help. Those things were not really offered to me as a kid. I mean, again, best meaning within my families, and I say my birth family because at 2.5 or so, I was adopted out of that family and some of that chaos into another family. But of course, who's going to pick this kid who's been through this stuff? Another family is dealing with alcoholism. So my father had problems with alcohol in my adoptive family. He kind of saw me, he loved me very much, but he also saw me as a little bit of a project. He was this kid who they were going to take in and kind of helped turn my life around and make great things happen. But of course, he had his own struggles. And the family, I say we weren't taught skills. Sometimes the skills we're taught maybe just aren't the most functional skills. So I was taught, don't talk about it. We can't acknowledge that this is happening.
Ignore it.
Yep. Right. Yep. We're just going to say, hey, dad was sick last night. Dad's tired right now. Let's just give him some room and some space. And so I was taught some of these things, sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly. Sometimes it was just watching, this is how we do, or kind of stepping on a family landmine. I would go and tell someone outside the family and then be told, hey, no, we don't do that. Or there would just be some outrage around it. And so, as often happens as a kid, I took on some of the traits, and all that sort of emotional energy that I was drawing had to go somewhere. So my behavior started to go sideways. And I became what we call, and I talk about this in the book, the identified patient of the family. Also, if you look at family roles, which also comes up in the book, the idea of the scapegoat in the family. And the idea of a scapegoat is the person who takes on all of these, well, we'd say traditionally the sins or the energy or the negativity within the family. They become the concentrated one together, and then we kind of push them away.
Yeah, like they're the one that has the problem. Don't look at us. Just look at them. Let's go fix that one.
Exactly. Yeah. And so my parents did put a lot of energy into try and fix me, help me out, stuff like that. But I wasn't having it. I wasn't taking it in, especially after the adoption experience. I wasn't very sure about trusting anybody. So I hit this, my first sort of hitting bottom was around 10 years old. And I went through the
pretty early.
Grade. It was pretty early. Well, I went through the entire fifth grade. I was so tuned out. I just did zero work. I basically showed up at class, but skipped fifth grade. No homework, no in-class work, all this kind of stuff. Being the communication style in our family, I didn't say anything. So parent-teacher conferences were coming up near the end of the year. I developed an ulcer. And my parents, of course, oh, you poor thing. And, everyone's trying to take care of me. And then the hammer falls because the parent-teacher conferences happen. And my dad comes home and he says, like, he's doing his best. He tries to sit down and say, what happened? What do you think about in class? And I had no framework or words to describe my experience. So I gave the only thing I could think of, which is I said, ice cream. That's what I've been thinking about all year. It isn't even that I thought he'd believe it. I just needed to say something to make it go away. But I came out of that experience and I thought to myself, it's got to get better than this. And I was able somehow, and I'm going to say today, I would say this is a gift from my higher power. At 10 years old, I was able to look and say, maybe it's me. Maybe I could change something in my behavior and it will get better next year.
That's so profound for a 10-year-old.
I look back and again, it's a gift. There's so many of these gifts in life. I'm very happy about the gifts that I have. I'm glad about the talents that I have. I'm glad the way I've developed them, but I have to recognize that I didn't pick any of those. I consider myself to be pretty intelligent, and I could be, wow, prideful me, I'm really intelligent. Or I could look and say, like, I didn't decide that. That's just something that happened. I also happen to have bad knees. I didn't pick that either. That's just one of those things that happens, right? It's just luck of the genetics. So for whatever reason, confluence of genetics and experience and all that, I had that thought. It could get better if I change something. Now, a thought that did not cross my mind is I could ask for help. Somebody else might know how to do this. So at 10 years old, I'm charging forward. I'm going to make my life better, but I have no framework, no guidance, and no ideas. Now, my parents, I think they took me at one point or another to a psychologist or minister, different specialists, but I wasn't letting anybody in. So that potential for accepting help was not received at my end. I'm not saying nobody offered anything. I just wasn't taking anything in. And that would take another 10 years. So I doubled my lifespan before I was ready to say, okay, maybe I'll listen to somebody else's ideas on this.
What has us not ask for help? I mean, that's a pivotal decision that we have inside of ourselves, oftentimes unconscious. What is the mechanism in your experience that's running behind I'm not going to ask for help?
Straight up fear. I'll give you the pro tip here as a clinical social worker and an addiction counselor. Big thing I've learned is whenever I run into any behavior that seems dysfunctional, not working well, lots of negative emotion, I'm going to say to myself now, what's the fear? And I say that to myself too. What's the fear? What's getting in the way? Could be I'm not going to be accepted. Could be they're going to laugh at me if I ask for help. It might be a sign of weakness, and maybe weakness got jumped down, when I was growing up, or
I might be abandoned.
Yeah. I mean, all those things. Yeah. It's not going to work out if I ask for help. And on a basic level, some of us may have self-image things going on saying things just aren't going to work out for me. The universe is tilted against me. Maybe there's a God, but whoever that God is doesn't like me, that sort of thing.
Right.
if we've asked for help and gotten slapped down in the past, or even if it was offered and it didn't work out well, we can come with the takeaway that it's just not worth the task.
Right.
So one of those fears or combination of those fears is often what gets in the way of people asking for help.
So you were in your 20s when did you have new realizations about how things were going in life?
Well, I had an interesting realization of meeting this young woman.
Mm-hmm.
And we got to talking, and one of the things we were talking about was growth. And, how do you grow, and what's it like in your family? Here's what I grew up. And we're having these great conversations. We're songwriting partners. We weren't getting together to date. She was dating somebody else, all this kind of stuff. But we're having, songwriting sessions and recording. And then we would just be talking for longer and longer afterwards. So we're talking about all these things. And I'm starting to think to myself, wow, she's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to blow it, because this is this cool collaboration, and I don't want to be that guy who goes, hey, I think you're really cute. And she goes, okay, run away now. So I sort of tiptoe into the conversation very shyly. And she says, well, actually, I like you too. And I'm actually looking to ditch the guy that I'm dating right now. But I want to do that well and ethically and all this kind of stuff, and concern for him, which touched my heart even more. She's a great person. Mm-hmm. And she also says, hey, I go to therapy. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking like, oh, yeah, I don't know about that.
Well, therapy in that time frame, because I can speak from my experience as well, was like a really bad thing.
We're in the late 80s here, so it's not a known, and I didn't have any stigma attached to it. I just had, again, that fear. What if the therapist sees right through me? Because I talk a good game, but I've never discussed this growth with someone else, with them helping me. Remember, I'm not accepting help here. And then she happens to be standing next to me once we've started dating. She's standing next to me, sitting at my kitchen table in the house that I'm renting. And I get this Christmas card, and I open it up, and it's from my birth father, who I've not heard from for 18 years, nor my birth mother. I didn't know who my birth parents were, because remember, I'm this adopted kid. So I've never gone looking for them, all this kind of stuff. And it shows up. It's just got a few paragraphs in it, or really like a paragraph and a photograph. And then a couple of days later, I get a card from my birth mother, and she says, like, I was not going to reach out to you, but since he did, I want you to get a more complete picture. So I start to have this experience as I'm dating this young woman who is into growth. And in that moment, my heart opens up, and it wasn't like on the spot, but over the next, I'm going to say, month or two, I come to the conclusion, like, this is the person I want to be with. And I don't know that might have happened if I hadn't had that heart opening. And so I said, would you marry me? And she says, yes. And her mom says, why don't I pay for you guys to do therapy together?
Smart mom.
Hey, oh man, let me tell you. And now I'm painted into a corner, because I'm talking this great game of how I love to grow, and I don't want to lose this young woman. And she says, we're going to therapy. And she even tells me the story of the last guy she was engaged to. She's only been engaged one other time. He went to one therapy session, he quit, and then they broke up. And I'm like, oh, that's not going to be me. Mm-hmm. So I start going to therapy. So it wasn't some brilliant, like me going like, oh, I'm open to help now. I was like, oh man, I got no choice. But I warmed to it and thought, this is fantastic. I didn't think at the time, I'm seeing this woman, she's a clinical social worker. She's doing wonders in our lives. We learned to communicate. We spent the first 6 years of our marriage going to therapy every week with this woman, Lee Strassman.
Wow, that's an accomplishment, Casey.
I didn't think it was an accomplishment. I thought it was like saving my butt. And I didn't think to myself, gosh, I should be a therapist. But later in life, like maybe another 10 years later, so you see these 10 years chunks, 10 years old, I think I can change my life if I change my behavior. 20 years old, okay, I'll go to therapy. 30 years old, I get into recovery from my addiction. And around 35 to 40 is when I think, actually, I could go back to work and I could be a clinical social worker like Lee is.
Yeah.
Maybe I could do that same thing. And all my life, people, high school, stuff like that, people say, oh, you're really easy to talk to. I feel like you can tell you anything. And again, some of those things that I didn't choose to be, but just sort of that happens to be the case. And once I was studying to be a counselor, I was working at this treatment center where they had strongly encouraged me. They were the ones who said, you should go back and be a counselor. I'm like, gosh, maybe I should. And along the way, they said, we want you to sit in on a family workshop. So you're just going to sit in the back. Don't open your mouth. Don't say anything, like, don't breathe too hard. But we just want you to see how this is. And I watched this thing happen when the family members came in, because I'm working with the clients day in, day out. Right. And it's a 9-month to a year-long treatment center. So you get to know people pretty well. But 3 different spots every 3 months in this process. The families would fly in and sit down for this family workshop. So I get to go sit in on it. And I just thought, what do I need to do to be able to do this? Because the power of when the family gets involved was amazing. And I started to listen to the message, and I was like, hey, if there's ever an opportunity. And one day they said, so-and-so is leaving. We want you to start being like the sort of understudy backup person for the family workshop. So I did that for, I don't remember exactly, probably a year and a half at least, working under Jackie R. Khan. She's fantastic. She became a social worker now. We all were kind of doing it instinctively. We're out in like the boonies in New Mexico, Wild West. We're all just kind of doing our best.
That's fun.
And then one day they said, hey, Jackie's leaving. It's your workshop now. Next weekend, you got 3 families flying in. Take it away, man. You got them for 3 days. Go to it. And you never forget that first workshop.
No. Were there some shaky knees in the process? Because you're impacting people's lives.
Well, there was perhaps moments of overconfidence, that sort of like confidence of not knowing even what you don't know. But I also had the confidence of working under somebody who really did this instinctively and getting to watch her at work and watch her process. And it highlighted for me the power of mentorship. So important to be able to see how somebody else is doing it. And out of that, I would think like, well, I'll probably do it a little bit differently someday. And then someday suddenly arrives and it's like, okay, it's your show now. What do you want to do? And I was like, well, I'm going to teach them about addiction in the brain. So they have some idea of what's actually going on here, because there's so much misunderstanding, especially among family members, and thought they need to know what's going on in the brain of their loved one. And we're going to talk about some communication skills. And this wasn't far from what we've been doing anyway. And in between, we'll sit down and just get a chance to really process the emotions that go around all these things.
Beautiful.
And
I've heard that trauma is the root of addiction. Have you learned that? Is that a something that you've learned through therapy? You want to help people understand that, or is that just a blanket statement that really doesn't fit everyone?
Well, what I'm going to say is it's maybe a little broad to be able to say for certain, but what I'm going to say is trauma is always intertwined with addiction. So there are some clients who will come in, or people that I meet in the rooms of recovery, who don't identify any childhood trauma. You read some of the stories, if you ever pick up the AA Big Book and read some of the stories in the back, some will say, hey, I had this idyllic childhood. Now, if I had followed them around, I might have said, oh, but this happened, and this happened. Remember when that, maybe people just don't identify it. That's possible. It's also not a level playing field. And we can get our point of view sometimes a little bit skewed by working in the field, because I work at a treatment center, and then I see clients in an outpatient basis. And people who are going to come into those settings, especially at a residential treatment center, are much more likely to have trauma piled on top of the genetic predispositions and personality characteristics that make it easier to fall into addiction. So from that point of view, I would say, for instance, pretty much everybody showing up at a treatment center absolutely has got some trauma in their background. And from that, it'd be easy to infer and say, okay, therefore, everyone must have trauma. But here's the thing. I tell my clients, even if you went into your addiction with no trauma whatsoever, I guarantee you'll have trauma by the time you decide you need recovery, because the addiction itself will be traumatic and it will lead to traumatic experiences.
Fair enough. I love that point of view. And we find our weakness through these addictions. I come out of a family that both alcoholic parents. My mother's version of alcoholism was combined with drugs, pharmaceutical drugs. And, I could tell that it was, as I got older, I could tell that it was avoiding a lot of the pain of her youth that I learned inherently in witnessing her mother and father interact. And then my father, his form of alcoholism was the one, I guess, if you're going to choose one, he was the guy that would go to the bar and buy everybody a beer, and everybody, play darts and everything's great. But he'd come home and, oftentimes wreck the car, or, fall on some furniture, or just not be present. And in both of their cases, what I learned as the oldest is that, in me witnessing them, it was an avoidance pattern from something that I could tell was inherently not well within the family. However, I didn't know what it was. And we walked around it like on eggshells. And my pattern of addiction was grow up and take care of everybody. So I learned that enabling side to hide the effect of what was going on inside the house, not have friends over, things of that nature, and then just make it all look good. And so is addiction, and we can talk about alcoholism. I think it's more prevalent to speak about alcoholism. However, addiction takes many forms. Is it something of a learning and an emergence and an evolution that we as humans go through at a greater level? What are the percentages of families that deal with these addictions?
Okay, so several great questions in there. One thing I'm going to take just a moment, can't resist, and point out that within the book, we talk about that idea of like those family roles and some of the stereotypes that go around them, as sort of stereotypically the oldest child is going to take on that family hero, make sure everybody's okay, shine in their own lives, be a high achiever, all those kind of things to help balance what's going on within the family, and often can take a parental role, not only to the other kids, but sometimes to the parents themselves. And one thing we know about alcohol use specifically is that we could say like, well, we're using it to treat some underlying depression, but we also know that the longer you drink alcohol, the more depressed you're likely to become. Now that could be because of, again, genetic predisposition. That could be also just because your life starts to get more depressing the more you drink. And also because there's a phenomenon that happens with any drug. And I very much count alcohol as a drug. And when I say alcoholism, I deliberately put that in the title of the book. I say alcoholism and other addictions. Alcoholism is simply addiction to alcohol. And so I mentioned that in the first paragraph or so of the book. And after that, I don't talk about alcoholism as any separate thing. In our society, we don't like to acknowledge alcohol as being a drug, but there's no real scientific definition for drug that wouldn't include alcohol, unless you say blah, 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 except alcohol.
Right.
That's has more to do with our society than it does any kind of scientific measure or effect on the brain measure. So touching on that, as far as I think I'm hearing you ask sort of like, how does addiction evolve within our society? Is that what you're asking?
Yes. Is it, well, how prevalent is it? Is there any study to understand? I know it's not something that we commonly go around and raise our hand, hey, that's me. But I guess statistically, how much is addiction within our families?
I'm going to say once you recognize the scope of what qualifies as addiction, and again, I touch on this in the very beginning of the book, is a little sidebar just saying, well, by the way, science is starting to acknowledge food addiction, sex addiction, love addiction,
work addiction,
shopping addiction. Gambling has already been acknowledged. Out of all the sort of behavioral, or they'll say process addictions, gambling is the only one that is officially acknowledged in the United States. However, the World Health Organization in, I want to say 2017, said, well, we recognize compulsive sexual activity. But the American Psychiatric Association, that writes this big book called the DSM-5, this latest edition, that's sort of the compendium of everything that goes wrong in your brain, has not acknowledged sex addiction. And that becomes a controversial topic for people, because it's really food, sex, and love addiction are the only ones that actually tie into survival centers in our brain in a whole different way, because we need sex for the survival of the species, and almost everybody has it, at least as an adult. Everybody needs to eat. Everybody needs love. So when we talk about being addicted to these things, people go like, well, how can you be addicted to something that's natural for the life process? But the big things we look at does it become compulsive? So do you tell yourself, I'm going to stop here, and then you keep going? Do you do more than you said you were going to do? Do you do it more often? All those kind of things. Do you experience withdrawals when you stop? And I have the privilege of conducting a therapeutic group at the treatment center where I work, Windmill Wellness Ranch, once a week, where we talk very specifically about these issues. And the clients who sit in on that group, know they are dealing with compulsive activity. And they will say, this came up in conversation yesterday, the withdrawal from sex and love addiction is worse than any drug I've taken. So when you say how many families does it touch, it's a staggering number. I was doing a family workshop one time. We did this big family tree. They call it a genogram, up on a whiteboard. And I have each one of the family members come up and fill in what they know about the family. Right. And the dad goes up, of our client, he goes up and he's filling some stuff in, and he puts his father up on the board, and he pauses for a second. He goes, well, I don't know if this would count where he was a sex addict, but he did have 30 affairs on my mom. And I was like, let's go ahead and put that on the board.
Let's go ahead. Yeah.
But the point is that even within families, people don't recognize it. So how big is
do
the problem?
they, or do
really
they
hard to say.
excuse it? I mean, is it not recognizing it really, like eyes wide open or wide shut, right? Or is it simply not having the courage to face that conversation?
All of the above. And if it's not even recognized that as an addiction, then all we can say is so-and-so has this bad behavior. And there's stigma around that. So a lot of families pass down generationally, don't talk about your feelings, don't talk about things outside the family. So if you run into, whether within your own family or someone you've talked to, like, we don't air our dirty laundry in the street, that sort of thing, or, you know, different versions of that, we may think, oh, well, yeah, that's natural, or that's what we do in our family, not recognizing that might be the result of generations of addiction. And the addiction itself will seem to skip a generation or two. And yet everybody in the family and every generation gets taught these things, either explicitly or through example.
Right.
You know, I had a family member come in a family workshop, and I noticed she would like smile all the time when talking about really, and she'd be crying and smiling at the same time. And I finally said, so what's going on with that? And she said, well, as a little girl, I was taught you have to smile. My mom would say, go in the bathroom and come back out when you can have a smile on your face. Like, go get cleaned up. And so that kind of thing, mom wasn't thinking, here's a setup that will make addiction easier to flourish in our family. Mom probably wasn't thinking, this is the result of my great-great-grandmother not knowing what to do back in a time where a woman could not initiate divorce and didn't have a lot of options. So if you married someone with addiction, you just figured out, what am I going to do? And then you would teach your daughters that, and they would teach their daughters that, and they would teach their daughters that. And then people would say, like, wow, how do people in my family keep marrying people with addiction problems? Like, what a coincidence. I mean, people I know will say, I married 3 alcoholics in a row. And I'll be like, do you think that's a coincidence, or that might that be the result of things that you grew up around, plus your own, again, we're all product, partly of our genetics as well, but all those factors coming together.
Yes. And you do mention in the book the genetic, like the biochemical response of the brain in addiction. And I'd love us to talk about what addiction really is, because as I've come to learn with your assistance and in understanding, you know, the different modalities to heal and to have awareness in addiction, that addiction itself is a biochemical, or can be a biochemical response in the brain and in the nervous system that leads to the compulsiveness of that substance.
It absolutely is. Well, the current estimate is about 40 to 60% genetic.
That's a large percentage.
50% of addiction is genetic, which is why you will know some people, and even within the same families, will say, everyone else in my family is addicted but me. And I was talking once with a nurse at a treatment center where I used to work, and you know, we were having this conversation. She mentioned everyone else in my family is addicted except me. And then she paused for a second. She goes, but I knew better. And I went, everybody knows better.
Yes.
It's not a matter of knowing better, but if we have the experience of, I decided to stop or not do it in the first place, and you can stick with that decision, then it's hard to imagine how somebody else can have the same thought and find that they can't stick with the decision. And what's worse is, on a conscious level, what it often feels like is we simply change our mind. We'll say, I'm not going to do that anymore. And then we go like, well, maybe one more time. Now, if you're listening to the audience, you think like, well, I don't have that problem. I'm going to challenge you to think, have you ever gone on a diet and then you didn't stick with it?
Right.
Whether it was a week later, a day later, a month later, or a year later, when you went like, you know, maybe donuts would be okay again. And then a little while later, you're at the donut shop once a week thinking, how did I end up back here? I had stopped this. Well, that is the exact same part of the brain. And it's a part of our brain that is trying desperately to keep us alive. Now, on that level, our brain doesn't care if we're happy. It cares that we're alive. And that part of our brain, in a part that we call the limbic system, can't think ahead more than 45 seconds. So any consequence that's more than 45 seconds in the future will get discarded in favor of, but I need to survive right now.
Wow.
And some people, for genetic reasons, combined with their experiences and how our genetics respond to experiences, because they do. So how our genes express will be changed by the life experiences we have. So if you have a tendency towards depression or addiction, that might lie dormant your entire life. Or it might spring forward when the right life experiences happen. And then somebody comes along and says, try this, you'll feel better. And it works. And your brain says, relief. Finally, where have you been all my life? And you talk to a lot of people who are addicted who can say their first addictive experience, whether it was a pill they found in their mom's drawer, whether it was the first sip of alcohol, whether it was their first sexual or romantic experience, whether it was the first time they went to the casino, put money on the table, and the very first time they won, whatever it is that happened, there was that moment where our brain makes that association. Wait a second, this right here is the best survival move you've ever made. We may feel relief from things we didn't even know we needed relief from until they fall away. Levels of stress we didn't know we were carrying until they're gone, and magically we feel totally 100% okay in our own skin, perhaps for the first time in our lives. And often this happens in adolescence, when we are not just more impulsive, but we are willing to take much more risk for much less reward than we would younger than that or older than that. So that adolescent age range, which can start as early as 8 and doesn't wrap up till about 25, that's a long period of time. But you talk to most people who are addicted and they can tell you most of their addictive activity, the seeds were planted then, even if it didn't turn into a full-blown thing for 20 years, the seeds were planted of somewhere in there. We formed that memory saying, this makes me feel okay.
Right. And from my experience, is it wasn't a substance that, I mean, it's very easy for us, at least in my viewpoint here, to say, if I put a substance in my body, I can identify this substance, this reaction, right? However, my addiction as it was developing was this action. I feel more powerful. I feel more certain in my life. I feel contributory. I saved the day, like you said, that hero's journey, right?
Yeah.
And I can definitely go back to those moments where I saved mom from, I poured out the vodka that was hidden in the vinegar bottle. I poured it down the drain. I saved mom. Or I told on mom when dad came home and made sure that she wasn't going to have more pills. These actions I can, just vividly go back to and know that that was my power source. In that moment, I no longer felt like a child that was, powerless. I had done something of meaning, and that wire got completely connected in my brain, and it just wanted to keep doing it. Even in school, saving a fellow peer from, failing on a test or something like that. I know that hero's journey and that high that I would definitely feel from being the good one, the right one, the one that excels, the one that saves the day. So I'd love to stretch our perception of what we are talking about here, because so easily, I know in speaking with some of my friends, it's easy to even see the word alcoholism on the front cover of a book and think, oh, that doesn't pertain to me, right? From my own journey of working in the family disease of alcoholism and drug addiction in my immediate family, I've learned that this is a life journey. This is self-development. This isn't always a substance. This isn't always something that we can easily pinpoint as a mechanism for addiction. Do you also see things in that way for people that are going on this journey for themselves?
Absolutely. One of the things that I see is, and this is if there's like one sentence takeaway from the book, it would be, you need your own recovery. You might pick up this book because you're thinking, this will teach me how to save my loved one. And the book right off the bat is going to say, that's not how it works. We don't have that power. We can't save people from themselves, even though we can fall into the illusion that we did. We can think to ourselves, well, I talked him into going to meetings, or I talked him into going to treatment, or I pulled her out of that hotel room and then she saw the light. But that's actually the other person making their own decisions on their own actions. They might have refused to leave their hotel room. They might have gone running right back to it. And some of us will see people do that. They might have gone in the front door of that meeting and walked out the back door. And while we think, I did it, finally, I saved this person that I love. And they might even turn to us and say, wow, you saved my life. And we hear those magic words, Mom, you did it. Without you, I wouldn't have made it. Well, the reality is Mom, first of all, is suffering, or whichever family member is going through their whole thing. And very rarely do people say, hey, where are you getting your support?
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about like that sort of addiction to the high of saving other people. We will get patted on the back for that. People will hand us a halo and wings. People don't say, are you okay? Is this becoming compulsive? Are you good? Where are you getting your support? So the book is going to just keep hammering home. You as a family member need your own recovery, independent of your loved one's recovery, and independent of how they're doing in that recovery. So there's a lot of hands-on practical knowledge of like, here's what happens in a day of treatment, but most of it's going to be about how you can grow as a person. And I like to think that would apply for practically anybody. And I could have just written a book called Here's How You Grow as a Person.
Right.
But there's such a specific need within the community of family members. And you figure everybody who has an addiction negatively impacts a whole circle of people around there. And then research shows us that those people will then negatively impact a circle of people around there. So at least 2 degrees of separation. And I'm pretty sure that's just as far as they bothered to research, because that was plenty, right? If I'm in my addiction, or I'll say when I was in my addition, I was negatively impacting people I would never meet. And yet all those people are rarely offered help. Rarely does someone come around and say, hey, all you people being impacted, are you good? Who's helping you? Here's some resources. Right. All the focus goes back on, if we could just get that person in the addiction to change, we'd all be okay. And I've yet to see any family system where that actually turns out to be true, but it's a very tempting illusion.
It's a fallacy, definitely.
So that whole idea is where can we offer help for those folks? Because here's what's really cool. Any one of those people gets in recovery, and it doesn't have to be the person with the addiction. Family member gets in recovery. They're going to positively impact everyone around them, who will then positively impact everyone around them. Now, do I have the research to prove that? I don't, but I know it. I know it in my heart because I also watch it happen. I watch people get in recovery and watch the positive impact on them, on their family, on everyone around them. And for family members, sometimes who could be just a little teeny bit, not a scientific term, but we'll say codependent, that might be their buy-in, or they're, it's like, hey, if you get into recovery, it'll help everyone around you. We're like, oh, I can get that, helping everyone around me. I can do that. But the dirty trick underneath that is, no, we're going to get you to help yourself.
Right. That's awesome. And you speak of that because in your own recovery, you've also noticed it for yourself and how that's rippled into all the people you now help.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate with that. A lot of people don't get the level of fortunate experience that I've had, but I got into recovery when my daughter was 2, so that'd be 23 years ago when I first started in. I was not thinking, boy, is this going to make a big difference in her life when she's 18, right? And I wasn't thinking, well, I'm going for this, but my wife better get in her recovery one of these days. But after I've been in recovery for 3 years, she came home and said, I just realized that I need to be working on my own issues. And not just vaguely like, maybe I need to go see a therapist, like I need to go find meetings. Because she realized that, and we've given each other permission to tell each other's stories in ways that might help people. So she realized she had compulsive stuff around food. And so I'm the sex and love addiction guy. She's the food person. We're each working our separate programs. Along the way, I discovered, hey, guess what? I need to stop drinking alcohol to facilitate this recovery. These things need to go hand in hand. Okay, so now I'm doing both. And then she starts going to some of those meetings as well. And one day my daughter, I want to say probably about 15, 16 years old, expresses jealousy. She's like, well, you guys get to go to these meetings and you have sponsors, you have steps you can work, you have all these people you can talk to. And I'm like swimming out here by myself. And I said, well, honey, you completely 100% qualify for a family recovery fellowship, like Al-Anon, Smart Recovery Family and Friends, any of these groups, like you 100% fit. And she tried it out. She decided ultimately it wasn't for her. She decided she liked individual therapy better. I am fine with that. Everybody's journey doesn't have to look like mine. Right. But I mentioned 18 because around 18, she sat me down at one point and just said, thank you so much for raising me with recovery. Thank you for bringing these principles into our home. And the way you and mom model things has really profoundly influenced my upbringing. And when I went into recovery, all I was thinking is, I want to get to raise this child. and I don't want to lose my job, and I don't want to lose my standing. I don't want to lose my legal status. I don't want to lose my wife. I mean, all these things were on the chopping block, right? All these things, I was getting ready to bulldoze them off a cliff. I wasn't thinking, let me make everybody's life better. I was just thinking, let me stop making things worse.
Yeah.
And
One
so
day at a time.
come out of it. Yeah. The gifts that have come out of it are amazing. They really have. But you're right. In the book, I mentioned that idea of cascading recovery. That one person gets it, another person might get it. And it's not necessarily the obvious person with a problem who's going to get it first. And there's no guarantee they're going to get it. But if 5 family members feel better and the one person is still struggling, I'm like, touchdown, victory. Exactly. We pulled it off. And I've had people come into the family workshop, to save their loved one, quote unquote. And by the end of it, they're saving themselves, and their loved one's going to have their own journey.
There's a term that I use. I say, change the dance and the dance changes. And it's, we're dancing. We learn this dance growing up. We learn a way to dance with other humans, especially the ones that we're most intimately connected with, because their love means the most to us, our safety and our security. And we learn these dances unconsciously. And whenever life gets to a place where it's no longer fun to dance that dance, the only one that can change the dance is ourselves. And so I liken it to, if you've ever learned how to dance, let's say the salsa, and you're dancing with a partner, and all of a sudden you start doing the tango while they're still doing the salsa. Something's got to get back into rhythm at some point, and you keep doing the tango because it's what's inherently good for you. And then the dance changes, and that instability brings with it the ability to grow. And to stop the pattern at some level, and then have curiosity in the process. And you've helped me, Casey, learn this for myself. And it's always a wondrous journey. Each week it's, oh, I learned this. Oh, and I see this. And it's not like I'm looking for it. I remember there was this part of my 20s where I was like with a magnifying glass on my own development going, okay, how am I growing? What am I doing? What am I learning today? And it was arduous and a lot of pressure. And so today it's this curiosity and this wonderment of, wow, okay, yeah, I can see things from a different perspective now. And it's just so freeing in my soul, and my voice has changed. Like literally I can feel my voice different within the constructs of my torso. And it's like a new gravity of self has emerged, new self-reliance and beauty that I hadn't known before. So I want to thank you for that.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to thank you for the energy and wonder that you bring to your own recovery and to this work. I'm also going to take a second and thank you for doing this podcast, because I've picked up some amazing things, especially as a guy like launching his first book and going like, well, in a way, it's sort of like things I've done. I'm a musician. I put some albums out, self-published, kind of trying to get stuff out in the world. I, was able to produce a screenplay for TV at one point that I was really proud of, and all these kinds of things. But I've never done this one before. And this is probably, as much as I would never have believed this in my 20s, this is closer to my heart than the music I put out with the band and all those kinds of things. And I poured my heart and soul into that stuff and loved it and believed in it and counted on it. But this book is, it just feels like, okay, if there's something I'm going to leave behind, this is it. And that was part of my mission. Was I do these family workshops, I see clients, on an outpatient basis. But if you don't happen to come across, like if your loved one doesn't happen to go to that treatment center that I'm at that time, or you don't happen to stumble into the office where I'm practicing, you're never going to hear the message this way. And I was kind of afraid there might be like too much ego in that statement. But I've had enough family members come up and say, hey, I've done a bunch of family workshops. We got shamed. We got told it was our fault. Or just nobody mentioned the stuff that you're talking about, or I've heard people say this stuff, but I've never heard it said the way you say it. And you talk in your, just in the intro, and very much one of the messages of your podcast, you have a voice that is uniquely yours. This is your message. And I did go out to look to see, like, do I even need to write this book? Maybe somebody else wrote it first. And so I went to look, and almost every book I could find for family members was a memoir, a year in my son's addiction, or how I, saved my wife or husband or whatever, that kind of thing. And the lessons we learned along the way with my brother. And those can be great. I did find one book that was written like, here's a sort of a manual for family members, but they led it. And I'm not criticizing, maybe some people need to hear this point of view, but they led it by saying, as a family member, it's pretty much up to you. You're going to be the one who saves your loved one. And I went like, that's kind of the opposite of what I'm saying. So there's room in the
Yeah.
marketplace for me, right? Okay. So
Yes.
I got my little book. I'm going to float it out of the ocean. It came out literally last week.
Mhm,
And in listening to your podcast, listening to people like Dory Clark, listening to
mhm,
Mike Kim, listening to some of the
mhm.
people, listening to just the message that you carry, I was able to listen to that, say, it's okay if I'm sort of starting from zero, but something
Yeah.
Mike Kim talked about, polish that message, work on that message, revise that message for years before you actually put out a product. And I went like, because I'm listening to the thing kind of bated breath, like, tell me I didn't blow it. And I listened like, oh, good. I kind of did that by doing all these workshops for years and years. I
Mhm,
mean, I've done hundreds of workshops and
mhm,
worked with thousands of families,
mhm.
not thinking, oh, I'm going to write a book out of this.
Right.
But at the end going like, okay, it feels like time to write a book. What book do I need to write? Oh, obviously this is the book. I've actually started another book on spirituality for people who hate spirituality, but I'll talk to you in 2 years about that.
Sounds good. Sounds
But
good.
this one's just kind of getting going. But I wanted to say that listening to this podcast right here and listening to you and some of your guests and the way you interview and the kind of people you interview and all that kind of thing has been really, really an incredible experience for me to learn and grow in a whole new area and to feel empowered to put this message out into the world.
Thank you so much, Casey. It's needed. I pray that we, as a society of humanness, get to a place where we can, with humbleness and courage and gratitude, look at the patterns within our families, look at the patterns within ourselves, and without shame. Maybe we feel shame at a small level. It's a natural emotion, but then we find the courage and the energy to move toward it, and know that it's evolving us. It's not something to shut in the closet anymore. It's not something to walk on eggshells with or have that big, that big elephant in the room. We have a lot of euphemisms for these types of things. I know I grew up with them. I mean, just a couple of years ago, we had the Me Too movement, and I was so grateful for that. I have a hashtag Me Too as well in my life, right? And the addiction for me, the addiction journey has been it's almost like the friction that has kept my tires on the road of my self-development. And it's not a shameful place any longer. It's not a conversation that I want to go, oh yeah, I had that. No, it's like, isn't this wondrous? Isn't this great? Because there's so many of us that have these things, and I grant us and pray for us to have the courage to not speak about these things as though they're painful in a sense that it was holding us back, because we can have regret about our story, but instead we embrace it with finding, well, why is this part of my journey? How am I supposed to bring this into my now and then grow from this with authenticity and courage and truth? Because I know my higher power has gifted me this lifetime so I could have these chapters in my life, and I know you're in a season of my life on purpose, and I think we all are. When we have that perspective, then life isn't as painful as we make it to be. And we find the courage and the strength to surmount it and become the warriors that we are.
Absolutely. So beautifully put. And thank you for that. And what you're describing is what often happens for people on a journey of recovery. We do start out feeling scared and shameful. And especially if we have been raised with some of those messages, consciously or unconsciously, don't talk about it. Don't let people know what's going on. Keep it inside the family, whatever version. But over time, as we embrace recovery, it becomes beauty in our journey. And those same things that used to be unspeakable now become an important part of our journey and our message. And so I just want to say, if there's anybody out there listening in the audience who thinks maybe this applies to me, or I don't know if I could speak about that, or I don't know if I could reach out for help, just to let you know, absolutely, there is hope, and it can get so much better. And it just starts by reaching out for help in whatever form works for you. Even if it just starts with telling somebody, I've never said this before, but in my family, blank. Or if you recognize you may be struggling with addiction issues yourself, I don't know where to go. That's okay. Everybody who started out, I'm actually going to quote a little thing from one of your previous guests, Mike Kim. Everybody starts at zero, right? That applies to recovery just as much. Everybody starts at zero. I'll never forget my first meeting, walking in just kind of terrified. And there was this guy who'd been to prison twice in California, where it's like his next strike was 25 to life. And when I showed up, he was the only other person in the room because I arrived a little early. And he smiled, and in so many words, he said, "It gets better." And I will never be able to thank that man enough. I still can see his face. I still know his name. I will never be able to thank him enough for just saying it gets better.
Yeah. And that's the fundamental within your book, Realistic Hope, right? Yes. I love the title, Realistic Hope, the family survival guide for facing alcoholism and other addictions. Name your own, right? Fill in the blank there. And so we can find your book on all electronic forms and the major book websites, such as Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Smashwords, Apple Books. Congratulations. I'm so glad you're on this journey for yourself. It's a legacy. I can feel it in you, your life journey here. Beautiful.
I want to clarify. Yeah. Paperback, electronic, whatever way you like to read things that exists. And because I do my own podcast, I have the equipment where everyone's like, you can do an audiobook. I'm like, the book's been out 2 weeks or a week yesterday. So yes, I'm thinking maybe 2022.
Yeah.
Get that audiobook started version of this. But yeah, no, it's out there. I'm thrilled to have it out there. And I'll mention, got the podcast called Addiction and the Family.
Yeah. And your website is addictionandthefamily.info, INFO,
yes.
Right? And I love your podcast. It's so real. You bring on real people that have gone through this journey and you help them feel safe and they tell their stories. It's so much to learn there. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Casey. And, we're fans. And so we're going to keep watching and listening and sitting at the hem of your wisdom so that we can increase our lives as well.
Right back at you.
Thank you again. And everybody, be sure to favorite the Light Your Life podcast and then sit with all of our wonderful guests because we are here on this journey to grow together and it takes a tribe. Thanks so much again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.